Resuming our discussion of paleoproxy data, starting with sediment cores and this image of the sediment that settled at the bottom of ancient glacial Lake Missoula. The dark layer and the light layer together make up 1 year. The light layer is generally larger sediment with less organic material, and the dark layer is generally smaller sediment with more organic material, signifying different inputs. These inputs could be from a nearby melting glacier or a river or other things. Often the larger sediment can settle to the bottom of the lake in the summer, but the finer, smaller sediment is suspended in the water column until the lake freezes over and becomes very still, which finally allows the fine sediment to fall to the lake bottom. I bet you can figure out how this information is used to interpret past climate information. What if a glacier melted a lot 1 year? Would that sediment layer be thick or thin? Got it. If not, watch the material again. You can also ask me to. Okay, on to type and number of fossils. As you know, different things prefer different growing conditions. For an extreme example, think of subalpine pine trees and tropical palm trees. Now, if you were looking at a layer of sediment and you found palm tree fossils, or a palm tree pollen fossils, you would know a thing or two about the climate, right? Maybe in a different layer of sediment in the same sediment core, you found pine tree fossils or pine tree pollen fossils. You'd know that the climate had drastically changed from tropical to subalpine in the area around your depositional basin, i.e. the lake you were studying. In addition, some animals grow differently in different types of water. Some snails curl differently, sinistrally or dextrally, in warm water versus cold water. The number of fossils will tell you what was thriving and what was merely surviving, assuming equal preservation rates. And this will tell you information about the climate. Lots of bushes versus trees, more grass versus more ferns, etc. Chemicals, in particular ratios of stable, i.e. not radioactive, isotopes of oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon can also indicate climatic conditions. Ice cores are excellent paleoproxy data for climate. Small bubbles of air deposited approximately at the time of snow tells us the composition and ratio of past atmospheric gases. In particular, we are interested in greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane. Also trapped in the ice are volcanic ash and other aerosols. Volcanic eruption and their ash are particularly useful in age determination for the ice layer. The isotopic composition of ice, in particular the ratios of stable isotopes, are useful in telling us the volume of ice on the land and other processes occurring in the paleooceans. All this information is about things that are affected by and also affect the climate. We already basically discussed pollen and sediment when we discussed sediment cores. The types of pollens found reflect climate, and the sedimentary layers are used to form a chronology. The graph has years and thousands of years. That's what the KYA stand for. K is like kilo. Along the y-axis, and along the x-axis we have the percentage of dry land pollen, with 4 different types of pollen identified: hardwoods, beech, subalpine montane, and herbs. So when the percentage of subalpine montane pollen is large, the climate was what? Right, generally cooler. Corals record conditions in the ocean. Obviously. Calcium carbonate in corals contains isotopes of oxygen and trace metals that can be analyzed for the temperature of local water and the age of the coral. In the mineral calcium carbonate, sometimes calcium is substituted for by strontium. The amount of strontium substitution decreases with decreasing water temperature. So, by looking at the ratio of strontium to calcium, you can see temperature changes in the water. Also, the amount of stable isotope oxygen-18 decreases relative to the amount of oxygen-16, another stable isotope of oxygen, as the water temperature decreases. Carbon-14 variations can give us information about solar activity, i.e. sunspot activity, to see if the climate was maybe warmer from increased solar output. This data needs to be used in combination with tree ring data because we need to know for sure the age of the sample, and we can just count tree rings to get that. Interestingly, variation in solar activity can explain some of the warming during the medieval warming period and cooling during Little Ice Age, but cannot explain current warming. Carbon dioxide, the most important proxy for temperature change. The data comes from instrumental record and ice core samples. These two graphs come from atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations collected from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii and glacial ice bubbles. Both graphs have time along the x-axis and carbon dioxide concentrations and parts per million along the y-axis. However, both the time and the CO2 concentration scales are scaled to fit the data. In the graph on the left, only instrumental data from Mauna Loa, Hawaii is used. The red line is the annual average value. The black line is from approximately monthly values. What trends do you notice? Yep, CO2 values are going up, up, up. But each year they fluctuate up and down. Any guesses as to why CO2 concentrations go up and down each year? Maybe some of you already know. This fluctuation is due to CO2 uptake by plants during the growing season in the northern hemisphere, spring and summer, depressing the CO2 atmospheric concentration. And an increase in fuel usage in the northern hemisphere to heat buildings increases the CO2 atmospheric concentrations a bit in the winter. Neat, huh? Now look at the graph on the right. What trend do you see here? The graph on the right combines data obtained from ice core bubbles and the instrumental record to show that until the Industrial Revolution, about 1800, CO2 concentrations were fairly flat to possibly decreasing a bit. Carbon dioxide atmospheric concentrations seem to follow temperature as far back as we can see. This graph has time spanning from the present-ish back 350,000 years ago along the x-axis. Along the y-axis, we have carbon dioxide concentrations in blue on the right and temperature in red on the left. What do you think? Do fluctuations in CO2 concentrations match temperature fluctuations exactly? No, but it's pretty close, especially considering all the other things that can influence temperature. Which brings me to my next point. There are lots of things that influence climate, and in turn, these things also influence each other. And if you try to think it all through and combine all the different types of climate data and paleoproxy data from all over the world, your brain may very well explode. So, to save our brains, we create models that blow up computers instead. These models are mathematical models used to describe natural events and are based on the general circulation model, which was used to forecast weather. The framework is a large stack of boxes, which are three-dimensional cells, with each cell varying in height. Many models use 6 to 20 layers of cells, as depicted in this image, with data arranged into each of the cells and mathematical equations used to describe the atmospheric processes that interact between the cells. Global climate models, of which there are many versions, are similar to the general circulation model, but used to describe climate instead of weather. Models are run backwards to see if historic climate changes can be modeled, and then into the future to predict climate changes. Models are generally reasonably consistent with global temperature change from 1900 to the present. Models are very useful in identifying needed data gaps. And the models generate hypotheses to test with data, ground truthing. Importantly, very importantly, note that models do not produce data. They are wonderfully complex, but they just use mathematical equations to link data. (12.5) Global warming. Global warming is the observed increase in average temperature of land and ocean during the last 50 years. It is mostly from burning of fossil fuels, which increased the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. However, both human and natural processes are contributing to warming. The graph to the right has time on the x-axis and degrees anomaly in Celsius. Degrees anomaly looks at the difference in temperature from a given normal value, often this normal value in the 1950 decade. However, other years can be chosen. Why do you think temperature is graphed as degree anomaly and not just the temperature measured? Any guesses? Treating temperature data as degree anomaly allows us to compare temperature data from all over the world, even places that have vastly different temperatures like Hawaii, Idaho, and Antarctica. The measured value for each place would be quite different, but the change in average temperature is similar. On the graph, we can see that the annual average anomalous temperature degree fluctuates quite a bit. Even the 5-year annual average fluctuates. Before the 1300 years the graph covers, the trend is definitely looking like we are generally increasing our average temperature. This next graph has the same axes. The different colored graphed lines are results from different models. The black line, starting after the 1800s, is the instrumental record. How would you describe the trend? I would say that temperature looks like it fluctuates a lot, but lately it has definitely increased, with temperature appearing to increase by about 0.4 degrees Celsius. That's about 0.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Doesn't seem like much, right? But lots of changes are starting to occur due to the small average increase. And since we are quite concerned with the present and near future, we naturally wonder how much warmer is it going to get? Well, here's what some models predict. On this graph again, the axes are the same, and the different colored lines are the results from different models.